Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. And let me welcome you to the 10th Annual Summer Institute for the History of Economic Thought. I think I know almost all of you, but in case I've not yet found you, to introduce myself, I'm Sandra Peart, and David Levy, who's sitting in the front, and I have directed the Summer Institute now for 10 years. Every year we experiment in various dimensions with the Summer Institute. Some things remain the same and some things change. And what changed this year is that we're welcoming you to the wonderful campus of the University of Richmond and to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. So let me just say I'm really glad to see you here. And I'm especially glad to see some of our George Mason colleagues here as well. Hi, David. David Levy, not David Warsh, said earlier today that we have perhaps as many George Mason folks who came down here as might go to Carroll Hall, so that's terrific. It's great to see all of you. The other thing that has continued, and it's been the anchor of the Summer Institute over the years, is that there are, I think, 3 people in this room who have been to each of the Summer Institutes. I might be wrong on this, but I'm looking around and I think I'm right, although I see David Mitch, so maybe I'm wrong. But so at least 3. Let me say at least 3. David Levy, myself, we have both been at all the Summer Institutes. But it's now a decade-long tradition for Jim Buchanan to open the Summer Institute. He's been at all of them. He's been a supporter of the Summer Institute, both intellectually and in many other ways for us. He's a very distinguished, of course, professor emeritus of economics at both VPI and George Mason University, with long-standing connections to the state of Virginia and what we call the Virginia School of Political Economy. So it's a great pleasure, and without more ado, I'd like to introduce Jim Buchanan, who's going to speak to us first today.
Thank you, Sandra, and I appreciate the opportunity to come back this year. You know, every year it gets a little bit more chancy, but I'm glad to be here. I was thinking about what I might start off with, and I think I happened to recall yesterday that I wrote a little note that the Journal of Economic Literature published, which I called An Outside Economist's Defense of Pesach and Saving. Pesach and Saving, in about 1967 or so, had written a little book, a textbook more or less in money, and it raised some interesting questions, and there was a controversy. And I've forgotten now what the controversy was about. It had to do with bank balance sheets, I know that. But in any case, it seemed to me that neither side knew what they were talking about, and I wrote a very simple little note, which I called a defense of the Pesach savings idea, which I've forgotten now what it was. But I mention that because again, I am intruding in territory in which I am not at all expert. I mean, I'm an outsider in the whole financial monetary analysis, theory, practice realm. So I'm coming at it from outside, so to speak, and I want you to stress that for you. But I think anybody who claims to have a union card as an economist must be, in a way, embarrassed by our failure, or the profession's failure, or the discipline's failure, to be able to say more about this current situation that we've been in, both in terms of diagnosing what the failure was, and in terms of suggesting any way we could have prevented it or how we could have got out of it. I think the profession has dismally failed in this respect, and that was the reasoning behind the title that David and Sandy put on the put on the title of my remarks. Actually, I have three, since last fall, I've been pretty well occupied with the intellectual energy that I have with trying to think about this crisis that we've been in. And I have three drafts of papers. In many respects, they are redundant and repetitive, but the arguments are slightly different in the three papers. None of them are ready to be circulated. None of them are quite ready to be circulated, but I think the titles of the three papers gives you a sort of a sense of the way my thinking has progressed as I've thought more about some of our problems that we have faced. The first paper, or the first effort, was one which I call Constitutional Failure. And I presented some elements of that at a lecture down at Virginia Tech back in a couple of months ago, back in April. Now, what I want to do in that, stress on that discussion under the term constitutional failure, was to stress the point that it is a constitutional failure that happened. It wasn't a failure of policy. It wasn't a failure of. It wasn't the greedy people. It wasn't necessarily the American consumer that got carried away. It wasn't necessarily the overextension of the rational expectations notions to where they should not have been extended. It was all of those things had bear some share of the responsibility, I think. But I don't think you can center in on any of those as central. It seems to me that what happened was a failure of our basic monetary, fiscal, financial institutions. Broadly speaking, our Constitution failed. Our set of institutions under which we were presumably operating failed. And I wanted to stress that as opposed to these other approaches which try to locate the failure in personal behavior or in policy changes or breakdowns and so forth and so on. And that was sort of the thrust of that first discussion that I had. And the second point or a little paper that I was hoping to finish up, I put out under the title, Economists Have No Clothes, because we've been parading around as a discipline, it seems to me most of us have, really very naked the last 50, 60, 70 years, that we haven't really contributed anything much, and we've just been wandering off into space. And it's time to recognize where we are, and I'll get back to that a little bit more later. But the third sort of topic, and I think this sequence of titles sort of gives you the way I think: constitutional failure, economists have no clothes, and the third one is what I call the constitutionalization of money. So I'm thinking in terms of moving toward trying to make suggestions as to how we might get some reform. But let me go back to this economists have no clothes. Why can we contribute, or why have we contributed so little, and why are we unable to make recommendations? And when we do make them, those of us who are economists and enter the fray can do little more than come up with rather tired, old-fashioned Keynesian ideas, as if we haven't progressed at all since the Keynesian nostrums of the 1940s, 1950s, early 60s. So we have to take a little sweep, and it's fitting in terms of this conference, I think, take a little sweep through the history of doctrine or history of ideas here over the course of the century. I think we would probably all agree, some of you might not, but some of you all agree that the Keynesian thrust which invented macroeconomics was scientific advance. least it got us to thinking for the first time in terms of these, what we could call the macro aggregates. We were learning better how to measure in aggregate terms. We learned how to talk about and measure gross domestic product, gross national product, rates of unemployment, rates of growth, rates of investment and savings and so forth. We started to talk about the economy in terms of those aggregates. And because we learned better how to measure them, and there was a feedback mechanism, and so and macroeconomics, I came out of that. We separated off as a field macroeconomics. So I think that was probably, at that limit, it was probably, you could say, a measure of scientific progress that we were able to do that. But then we may slipped over into thinking that because we could measure them, and because we could talk about them and talk about the economy in those terms, we could somehow manipulate them. So we could get the economy to move whichever way it wanted to move. And that was a gross error. I mean, and I'm probably the only one in this room could remember what happened to economics in the immediate post-World War II years, where we had all these predictions coming out of Washington about the over-savings, how we were going to have too much savings and we were going to have, therefore, permanent depression. Therefore, we needed permanent deficits. And of course, that was completely wrong. I used to say that, or not only me, but others said that economics was crucified on the Keynesian cross. Samuelson's textbook sort of took the day with its diagram and then, of course, a complete failure in terms of the predictions. But we stayed with the modeling. We didn't drop that immediately. We modeled the economy as if somehow we could manipulate it. We could move around those aggregates once we could measure them. Again, I suspect I'm surely the only one in here who ever actually saw the Phillips machine. A.W. Phillips, called Bill Phillips, yes, the same man who invented the Phillips curve. You've probably heard of him in that sense, but he was originally an engineer, originally an Australian, who worked at the London School of Economics, and he invented a machine that perhaps was about the size of this table, but it would stand on end. And I actually saw it. Abel Lerner brought it to one of the American Economic Association meetings one time, and I actually saw it. And it was a hydraulic type machine in which you put various fluids in it and represented the economy. And they had these tubes running and intersecting and mixing and carrying on. You punch a button, and you start this tube, and there would be blue ink going one tube and red ink going another tube and green ink and these various things. And you punch saving, you increase savings, certain things would happen. If you increased investment, some things would happen. If you changed the foreign balance, something would happen. And out of that would come a result. So it was a hands-on idea of manipulating the economy to get whatever result you programmed into it. That didn't last very long because, again, it was economists came to recognize that there wasn't much you could do about that. It wouldn't work that way. But we still were thinking in terms of these macro aggregates. And then people started worrying about, well, what about some micro foundations? How do you get there behaviorally? How do you get these things? So then you slipped over into the micro foundations of aggregation. And so by mid-century, or especially by the 1960s, you sort of had reached the heyday of this modeling and those terms, and we were beginning to have questions, beginning to worry about some of these questions. But it was still true on well past that time that economists were thinking of in what you might call an engineering mindset. That is to say, the economy could be manipulated if only you knew how to do it. could be manipulated to produce whatever the results were. And it was off the track already in that sense. And it was off the track in the sense that they began to worry about picking up what was economics really all about. And they went back to Lionel Robbins' definition of in 1932, where he said the economic problem is the allocation of scarce resources among alternative means, and then you superlarded onto that the Keynesian notion that you want to get all resources allocated, the employment notions, and sort of still a engineering type mentality in that you're getting some results that you know you want and you can get there. Where they had failed, it seemed to me, is that recognizing what the economy really was. There was no or very little sense of the economy as an emerging order of a complex set of interchanges out of which emerges outcomes, but these outcomes cannot be manipulated and they can't be, you may measure them, but you can't really get very far by trying to presume that somehow you can promote whatever outcomes you want to promote. So there was a failure to look at the underlying structure. What can economics contribute? If you recognize that you can't really manipulate the economy, what is the economy? Get back to basics here. The economy is this complex network out of which outcomes emerge, a very Austrian type view, or Hayekian type view, I should say, not necessarily Austrian. And then what can we do? What can we do? What is the role for economists if you take that view? Understanding this complex world, but we can also begin to get some normative elements in it if we think in terms of, well, we can't necessarily generate outcomes that we want in terms of this is what we would like for the economy to achieve, and let's manipulate it so it can achieve it. We can at least impose and begin to analyze the constraints, the rules, the sets of rules out of which these outcomes emerge. Use a simple analogy. You can't, if you're going to put some sheep out in the pasture, you can't possibly program each sheep to know exactly where each sheep's going to be so that you'd have a specific outcome as to where the sheep would be located. But you can at least change the fences on the pasture so that you know that you locate them within certain limits. You know, you can impose constraints. And it should have been the sort of constitutional approach, that is to say, look at the rule, look at the constraints within which outcomes must indeed emerge. And to that sense, we can take a normative role if we take a sort of a constitutional, rules-oriented perspective. And we can generate out of that not specific outcomes, but we can generate what we might want to call patterns. And Hayek was right in the sense here in which he talked about pattern predictions. We can't make predictions, but we can make pattern predictions about what would be the general framework. And some of those sets of outcomes that might be predicted to emerge within certain constraints are therefore a better set, evaluatively better than other sets. And so we can think about in those terms about better or worse sets of constraints. The whole notion of sort of constitution of economics. I entitled my Nobel lecture in '86, I entitled it The Constitution of Economic Policy, depending heavily on Wicksell, who had said or implied in a lot of his work that the way you change policy is not to change outcomes, but rather go back to change the rules by which these outcomes emerge. And a lot of nonsense has been written in the last year, it seems to me, about the failure of capitalism, or the failure of markets. And I think it's tragedy that Richard Posner has published a new book called The Failure of Capitalism. Capitalism doesn't fail until you specify what the constraints are. It's true that capitalism failed given the set of constraints that we had in play, but we had the wrong set of constraints in play. And so you properly ask the question, you'd say under this or that set of constraints, will the market work, or will capitalism work to generate that pattern of results that you desire? And I think a great deal of false rhetoric has been spilled out over about this capitalism failure or market failure notion. Now this gets me over to the sort of third aspect of what I have been working on, that is what I call this constitutionalization of money. I hope to get a paper in shape for that to give at the Mopelan Society in Sweden in August, if I'm able to go, and I hope I'm able to go. And that's going to generate a great deal of discussion, because what I start out by saying is that the market will not work in monetary anarchy, and collectivization or politicization is not an effective alternative. So what are we left with? That's the whole question. What are we left with? And I do think what we had prior to 1908, and still do have even more, is monetary anarchy. And in anarchy, you'll never expect to get outcomes that you desire. And certainly politicization will foul up. So what are we left with? It's a true Scylla and Charybdis notion here. And that's where I come down on this notion of constitutionalization. This was touched on in our discussion last night around the table at dinner, where I believe it was Richard Timberlake who mentioned this notion that somehow or another we need to set up money as a kind of equivalent to a weights and measures. Now, our founding fathers had that in there. They said, Article 1, Section 8 said, the Congress shall have the right to coin money and regulate the value thereof. And in that same sentence, it went on to say, and to establish weights and measures. Well, money should be treated as a weight or a measure. Now, what does that imply? What are we talking about here? That means we have to have institutions that will operate this way, and we have to have a general psychological attitude about money that completely shifts money away from ordinary politics. And I take in this third paper that I'm working on, I take the inspiration here not from Adam Smith, but go all the way back to Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, in his Leviathan, which is written and published in 1651, right in the middle of the English Revolution, said that people demand security, and they will turn over to the sovereign authority in exchange for security. But Hobbes was primarily, understandably given his time, he was primarily thinking of security in terms of person and property, real property. All I'm suggesting is that somehow or another we got to get money into that. We should now think of the sovereign as being in charge not only of the security of person and property, that is the enforcement of contracts, enforcement of property rights, but also the maintenance of the value of the monetary unit. And that should be a part of the sovereign contract. I think political philosophers, political economists, and others have made a big mistake in their failure to make this distinction. The sovereignty is exercised on two levels, two quite different levels. One is the level of ordinary day-to-day politics as we understand it. And the other is at the level of enforcing the law, that is the property rights, contract, and the sovereign is in charge of both of these in a way. And this distinction between these two levels of sovereignty as exercised, I think, is a critical one that we have neglected. Now, I've emphasized this to some extent by making this distinction between choice at the level of the constitutional rules and choice within a set of rules as adopted, using the game analogy a lot in my own stuff. Hayek was making the same distinction in a different way, he and Leone, when they talked about the distinction between law and legislation. He and Leone both believed in the fact that we should not allow collective action on the law, that should be determined by an evolutionary process, and we couldn't do much about that. But that's quite different from legislating within the structure of the law. He was making that same distinction. And I think we've got to move that in that direction. That's what I mean by the constitutionalization of money. I mean to say, if we're going to get out of this problem and going to have any viable, continuing economic progress, not being subject to these crises like we've had for the last year and a half, we're going to have to move the value of money as a target into the law, as opposed to into politics, and as opposed to just letting anarchy prevail, which is what we've had. So whether we could get there, can we get there from here? We probably can't. You can't imagine political leaders of today doing that, or you can't imagine people getting to the point where they would, in fact, treat the dollar that way, treat our currency that way. But to me, that's a sine qua non of making any progress. The closest it seems to me historically that we have come to having something like this is probably the British pound prior to World War II. It wasn't explicit, but a pound was a pound was a pound out throughout the world. And this is seeming like a little simple point, but it makes you think a little. You value under a genuine monetary constitution in which you constitutionalize money. You value money because it is money, and if it's a commodity base, you value the commodity because it is money. You don't value the money because it is a commodity. That distinction, and a lot of discussions about the gold standard, seems to me to be all mixed up. Gold was valued because it was money. It wasn't money was valued because it was represented a certain amount of gold. It's a different way of looking at the whole thing, it seems to me. And it seems to me as we move from commodity-based money to fiat money, whether printed paper or entries in computers, it seems to me we move from a situation where there was a categorical distinction that we have failed to recognize. The categorical distinction is that when money is on a commodity basis, whether it be bricks or whether it be gold or whatever it might be, it takes resources. You use up resources. And therefore, it makes good sense to economize on resources. So it makes good sense to have leverage or fractional reserve banking. Whereas if you have a situation where it costs you nothing to create money, zero cost of creating it, it makes absolutely no sense in aggregate valuation sense to have fractional reserve money. You can have 100% no problem whatsoever, because it costs you nothing to print it. So why economize on something that you don't use resources to print, to secure? So it seems to me the underlying logic of fractional reserve banking is simply no longer there. I don't understand any logic whatsoever for fractional reserve banking in a pure fiat standard, in the limit costless, where money can be created costlessly. I know several people here from last night's discussion disagree categorically with me, and no doubt people in Sweden will be very upset. Some of them will be. Now, I'm talking now about a constitutionalization and all these problems within the context of the United States dollar and our problems. And I'm going away from this notion somehow that Hayek developed 20, 30 years ago about where you have competing national currencies. I was a gung-ho advocate of Hayek's federal scheme for money when Europe was going into the, before it went into the euro. It seemed to be a perfect timing for something like a Hayekian scheme under denationalization of money. Could have been put in, but they didn't. They went down the road of a single currency with the euro. And so I think if you think in terms of the way I'm thinking now, we should try to maintain, in the United States, we should try to maintain the dollar as the international unit of account. But in order to do that, we're going to almost necessarily have to move in the direction of constitutionalizing money. If we don't constitutionalize it in the sense that I'm talking about, then the dollar will lose out. And the euro, if Europe had enough political savvy, so to speak, they might still establish the euro in this sense, if they could constitutionalize the euro. And maybe they'd have a better chance of isolating it from national politics than we would in this country. So I think the next 20 years or so are going to be critical in this respect. I do think that one more little point I'll make, and then we can throw it over for some discussion. Again, it's based on some of the things that came up last night in our discussion. I think there's a difference between, say we constitutionalize money and say we're going to establish the value of the dollar as stable, we're going to stabilize the value of the dollar. Okay. Now, one way, and this is the way I was thinking about this up until quite recently, and again, I come at it from the outside very naively thinking about it this way. The way I was thinking about it, which I learned from Henry Simons 70 years ago, and which Friedman also mentions in his little book, The Optimal Quantity of Money, is the reason that you need 100% money if you're going to stabilize the dollar is that people cannot, by switching between two types of what they think of as money, between deposits and currency, or the equivalent to modern leverage deals, by switching they can make it much more difficult for any central bank to stabilize the value of money. And so you want to, the way you get people not to do that is to not allow these differing types of money to exist simultaneously and be used simultaneously. But the way you allow the market forces to help in that respect is by, of course, allowing convertibility into some base commodity, gold or whatever, bundle or whatever. But if you think of this in terms of what I'm thinking of now, of a constitutionalization aspect, shifting it into law, out of legislation into law, becoming a part of our law, sovereign authority, that is to say, you don't have to think in terms of a convertibility backup. You don't have to think of a convertibility limit. It becomes the law, and therefore, if the monetary authority that you set up fails to enforce this law, then you somehow bring sanctions against the members of that monetary authority. That's a different context, it seems to me, from this notion of somehow requiring an ultimate convertibility. I'm not sure about this. Now, Leland and others have worked a lot more on this than I have, but that's some of my current thinking, and I think that making this distinction and putting money into law as opposed to putting money into legislation becomes a very important part of this. And of course, our whole central bank notion has no constitutional basis whatsoever. So it's no telling what the courts will do when they get this, and maybe they should get it. I'm coming to the view that maybe the courts should take some action and decide some of this. So I'll just leave it right there, and then we'll have some discussion.
Just face the crowd and say we'll take questions for the next 15 minutes or so. Raise your hand and we'll recognize you, Leland.
Jim,
Please speak up so that everyone can hear you.
I think it might clarify what you mean by 100% reserve money if you would describe the legal provisions that would be necessary to enforce this.
I'm not sure as I have got that far in my thinking. What I want to do is somehow prevent this shifting amongst near monies from having multiplier effects on the aggregate operation of the economy. David and I were talking about this yesterday driving down, about what do we mean by near monies. But clearly we are in a situation, or were in a situation, where there were all sorts of near monies. People were treating things as money, with money values. And somehow or another you've got to eliminate the possibility of people simply shifting and then having multiplier effects and spilling over and therefore generating what is the modern equivalent of a run on a bank. I'm not sure, again, I'm neophyte in terms of this. I'm not sure exactly what you'd have to require to eliminate that. But it seems to me that it's a potential it could be eliminated somehow or another. Implication of your point, I guess, is that even if you tried, you couldn't do it. And you may be right. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure.
Marcel?
Marcel Baumann from the University of Amsterdam. You started your talk with talking about the economy, maybe something that maybe can be manipulated. You referred to the Philip machine.
Yeah.
And in this sense, it is a very interesting machine because it is not based. Philip was an electro engineer, so his later models looked much more like electro engineering. But the hydraulic machine he created together with Newland was a water machine, and it was very hard to tackle. So when experience with this machine at the London School of Economics was that students had to play the role of the central banker and had very many difficulties to run that kind of economy. So it is a nice example of how difficult it is to manipulate the economy.
Well, that's good information. I didn't know that. That's good information.
Jim, when you said that no one else in the room had seen the machine, I knew Marcel would stand up here. Elliot.
You mentioned the metaphor of letting sheep into the pasture and in order to distinguish between law and legislation, and the idea that constitutionalization of money, we have items in the Constitution, but we all know that even if we write something in the Constitution, it's always going to be up to interpretation by judges, and challenges that a country might face.
Yeah, everything you say is correct in the sense, and that has been the standard critique of this whole constitutionalism notion, that somehow or another you're going to not be able to lay out a constitution such that the judges will not be allowed interpretive power or authority. And that's certainly true, and if you think of a practical look at the world. But I think it's critically important in the way you think about this is to think in terms of a distinct role for the judge or the umpire. Again, I come back to the game analogy all the time. That is, the game is played by the players, but the umpire is determining whether or not the rules are followed. Now, it's true that the umpire, in many cases, will in fact be interpreting it in such a way that it won't be distinct. Take a tennis game. Tennis game's been played a long time on a clay court, and the lines have been erased. And you have an umpire, and is this ball in or out of the line? Well, he interprets it. He interprets where the line would be, but it's critically important that he interpret where the line would be. That the judge think of himself in the role of determining what the law is, not what the law should be. This is something that Bruno Leone always stressed about this is the characteristic of Roman law, he would say. That is to say, the judge, even though you recognize what you say, every point you recognize, it's true, but the judge has to act as if he is finding the law rather than inventing the law. And that's a critical distinction here. And that has to be recognized, and the problems have to be recognized. And as you move to something like constitutionalizing money, that would become perhaps even more critical than it even is in other areas. Some areas it's fairly clear, others it's not.
From Freiburg, Germany. I have a question concerning your attempt how to constitutionalize money. You put forward that you are against fractional reserve banking. You are standing up for 100% reserve ratio. And the other issue is that you want to be ensured that there are weights and measurements. That means something like the Freiburg school put forward with the metric monopoly. That means weights and measurements as a rule to the central bank how to coin money and what could be money.
Right.
So I have one question. Right now there is some vivid academic debate in the free banking field between the Mises Institute, who put forward the old Mises-Rothbard plan, and Selden and White, who stand up for their vision of free banking. So with these two aims, that means you are for 100% banking, and the other issue, weights and measurements, it is really close to the Mises and Rothbard plan, which is under attack by Selden and White due to this provision of the fractional reserve. They don't see it, that 100% is important because examples have shown in the Canadian free banking example or in the Scottish free banking example that it would work out with the 10 to 15% reserve ratio too. And the other issue would be if your vision here, if your plan is really that close to Mises and Rothbard, you should, or do you implicitly favor gold? This would be one of my questions. And then the other case would be, do you then basically overthrow this idea of the denationalization of money? Because this is what I didn't really understand when you were talking, because you still favor this idea of the federal scheme of the denationalization when we're talking about the European monetary integration, but I somehow understood that you don't like this completely deregulated free banking scheme as he put forward in the denationalization.
First of all, I know that these debates exist, but I don't know anything about them to even comment in an informed way about which argument on which side. I certainly am not I'm categorically opposed to gold here in the context. I'm thinking of a constitutionalization in terms of a pure fiat currency, in the limit a costless currency. I reject the notion of free banking. That's what I mean by monetary anarchy. It might, something like free banking might be better than what we had, which was anarchy in another context. And I certainly don't want to enter the battle on either side of these particular arguments about the, again, goes back to Professor Yeager's question, that is earlier. I'm not sure exactly what would be required to implement the type of reform that I'm talking about. I haven't got that far in my thinking. But I'm trying to think in terms of this little very, very elementary point that didn't hit me hard until the other day. That is to say, when you have money that is costless to produce, what value is there of having institutions which are designed to economize on the use of that? That's what a fractional reserve system means to me. There's absolutely no sense in economizing on something that costs nothing, as opposed to so there's a categorical difference between a money that is somehow that kind of money and a money which uses resources, whether it be gold, whether it be a bundle, whether it be brick, whatever it might be. That's the line I want to draw. And it's interesting, I went back and I didn't learn that from Henry Simon, because he didn't stress that. He stressed this switching back and forth of people amongst near monies. And Friedman in the Optimal Quantity of Money book, he mentions the fact that fractional reserve banking is bad because people, it makes it more difficult to control the supply of money. That's what but he doesn't make the point I was trying to make. And I think one reason it's so obvious once you think about it, but I just hadn't thought about it that way before.
Hello, my name is Michal Lehota, and I'm an analyst from Slovakia. I would like to ask, if I followed your arguments about constitutionalization of money, I thought of that you mean keeping the value of money stable, but isn't this already in place in case of inflation targeting or independent central banking, which is the case of the European Central Bank?
It's related to that. It's related to independent central banking, except that it would be independent in the sense it would still be a sovereign authority of government. It wouldn't be independent from politics in that sense. It would be constitutional independence here. It would be, first of all, you'd have it in the Constitution. You'd have the target in the Constitution. So and every step you make in the direction of moving toward targeting does in fact move a little bit in that direction. What I want, and I haven't mentioned it actually, I got this far without mentioning it, Sandy. I haven't mentioned my favorite phrase, the relatively absolute absolute. But the relatively absolute absolute is what I want money to be. That is to say, people in their attitude think of the dollar is a dollar is a dollar, nothing more. Now, it's possible that the United States will foul up so. The euro could possibly become that again because you'd have this competition. It'd make it more difficult for one nation to sort of slip away into overt politicization. That was my hope for Europe originally, and whereas Hayek's scheme could have worked at that level 20 years ago. But maybe if somehow or another you could constitutionalize the euro, get people to agree that the value of the euro is going to be stable, then that becomes the international unit of account and the dollar loses.
As the umpire here, I'm going to take one more question. Jonathan, go ahead.
Jonathan White, University of Richmond. I always thought that money was whatever solved certain kinds of problems for producers and consumers and savers. And that fiat money, of course, has certain legal things associated with it. solve a lot more problems than some fiat constitutional money. And so therefore you will have a legal constitutional money, but then you'll have the vast underground economy using some alternative, more innovative and solving more problems kind of money. So my question is, what do you think of this?
Well, I'm not sure. I think my main impression would be negative, that that would not be a problem or need not be a problem. I go back to what we had before this crisis. It seemed to me, looking on it from perspective of now, it's absurd to think of our situation such that we were creating all that value in the financial sector. There cannot be any real value there. It's all paper. It's all artificial. We were generating a large share of our gross financial product by just these institutions that were superlarded on top of each other and integrated with each other. I wouldn't dare to know exactly what was going on. But you have to get back to the fundamental purpose of money. Go back ever since David Hume, at least, we've known this very well. Fundamental purpose of money is to simply provide the veil, the oil that makes the engine work. The engine's still got to be there. And think of the analogy with an ordinary combustion engine. It has to run on gasoline. It won't run on oil. Now, you can make your oil thinner, you can have financial innovation, you can make your oil thinner and thinner and thinner, but you cannot get it to run on oil. It's got to run on the gasoline. And the only thing money could possibly do is to make that oil a little thinner. And you've got limits to what these financial innovations can do, or else you're going to get into fraudulent type circumstances, it seems to me.
Let me draw this to a close and say that we'll take a quick break, 10 minutes, and then come back. The full morning is on financial crisis considered historically, so I'm sure we'll continue these conversations. Please join me in